should I test?
Well, the problem is testing reading is really difficult. It seems to be one of the easier skills to test, but I suppose everyone thinks that testing their skill is most difficult, but I think reading is very tricky indeed. The temptation is, when you're doing a reading test, is to just take a passage that has a few questions that can be asked on it and give the questions and decide there's your reading comprehension test. But if you look at those questions afterwards, of course, it's quite clear that you're not testing all the skills that are involved in reading. You might just be testing identification of facts, and you might find all your questions were based on dates or addresses or names. They were all identifying facts, whereas, of course, reading is much more complex. And indeed, it would be nice, in a perfect world, if you have the time to do a decent reading test, to think of the abilities that go into reading, the skills, and try and test several of them. So, for example, you might want to have items testing inferencing or a whole string of skills and strategies used in reading that should be covered. So it's useful to have a list beforehand, probably, if you have time, to have a set of specifications, which will be talked about, of course, in another video, where you list the skills needed in reading: skimming, scanning, looking for small pieces of information, looking for the general meaning of a paragraph or something like that, and then try and sample items from that list. If you need to look at a particular list, Heaton has an example, and so does Weir. There are lots and lots of examples of these lists. But you need, when you've written your test, to try and check whether the different test questions cover different ones of these lists.
How should I choose the reading passages?
Well, again, this is very, very tricky, because the first and foremost requirement, of course, is that you choose passages upon which you can ask good questions. That's crucial, and often it looks as if a text will be fine when it isn't. You just cannot ask enough questions of that text. But that is not everything, of course. There are so many things that come into play. You have to consider the purposes of your students, and it is probably, certainly at the moment, we feel that it's best to use texts that are the sort of texts people will read when they are using English. So, for example, if you have students going abroad to Britain for a summer course, you might want to give them texts of TV times, in English TV times, or perhaps a timetable, or a pamphlet or a brochure. Similarly, if you're testing students who are going to go to an English medium university, you might want to give them academic texts so that they have the same sort of text that they will have afterwards. I think, as much as possible, it's good to have texts that are similar as possible to the real thing. People talk about authenticity. I don't think the texts need to be totally authentic, but they should look authentic and be as near authentic as possible. Sometimes you find it's impossible because they turn out to be ambiguous, your authentic text, and you may want to change the text a bit. But on the whole, they should not only seem to be authentic, but they should look as if they're authentic, I think, and be presented in an authentic way. Now, what other points are I going to make? Yes, it's a good idea to have several texts, because just one will be less reliable. You've got another video on reliability. So it's a good idea to have several texts, partly because the test will be more reliable, partly because you can then vary things like the genre, the topic. Some students may be more familiar with one topic than another. You can also have one short text, for example, for intensive reading when you're looking for specific facts. You could have another text which is longer for skimming and scanning for extensive reading. So it's good to have a range of texts.
So how should I test these passages?
Yes, well, again, all my answers depend. It depends on who the students are and the circumstances. But as with texts, I think it's good if you have more than one sort of test method, because some people thrive on one test method and some on another. For example, there's been research to show that if all the tests is based on multiple choice questions, some students may do better and some worse than they would otherwise. Multiple choice questions can be very, very good for testing reading comprehension, but they're very difficult to write, And I think that you should only embark on using multiple choice questions if you are a trained and experienced writer in multiple choice questions. And you need to pre-test those multiple choice questions to see that they're working well and that the alternatives are working all right. I myself have found recently that people are not trained in writing multiple choice questions, and they do not write good ones. They don't work very well. I prefer, well, there are various ones I prefer. What I like best, I think, are short answer questions. I'm trying to think of sorts where you can mark them objectively, because many people haven't got time for long subjective answers, and anyway you'll be testing production then and not reception. But short answer questions, limiting the answer to, say, 3 words, they can be very revealing, and they're fairly easy to mark, especially if you try them out and find all the possible alternatives and put those in your answer key. So short answer questions where you ask an open-ended question and they give their answer. Then I like selection of headings can be very good. It depends what you're testing, of course, but if you're trying to get at understanding of overall meaning of a passage, having headings and putting in your own headings is very good. If you ask the students to produce their own headings, that may not be very helpful for the marker because there's such a range. But if you use matching, which is another technique which I think is quite good, where you provide possible headings with a few extra ones, and the students select the appropriate heading for each paragraph, that can work very well. You need to have more in your list for matching than you do actually of headings required, because otherwise people can use elimination for getting rid of them. But matching is very useful in lots of sorts of testing because it's easier to mark, like multiple choice, but there is wider scope. For example, another method I like for advanced readers is the gapped summary, where the test writer has a text, they write a summary of that text with gaps, and then the student has to fill in the gaps. It has to be well written, of course, so that you can't fill in the gaps unless you've understood the original passage. But that works very well, particularly if you have matched phrases or words which you select. Have many more than the gaps you need, and make sure that you can't fill in the gap purely by grammatical understanding, so that if you require a verb, make sure that there's more than one verb in your list of matched examples. I think that's a very good method. Another method which perhaps doesn't need matching is information transfer, where you get text, you understand the text, and then you transfer what you've read into, say, a table, which might have, I don't know, sorts of ultraviolet rays. I was thinking of one in particular, where you read the text and you have all sorts of columns talking about the level in the atmosphere of these ultraviolet rays, what effect they have on the ground, and so on. Turning what you've read into a table or chart can be very, very good. Finally, the true-false questions, they're not good if they're just true-false, I don't think, because there's a possibility of 50% getting the items right anyway. You have to have a lot of items in order to make them reliable. But if you have 3 categories, so that you also have a not given in the text, it can be very useful, it can be very searching. But again, you would have to try out this item type very carefully and see whether it works, and whether everyone agrees whether the answer is wrong or whether it's not given, because it's often difficult to tell. With all these ones, you must try them out, I think, as much as possible, either on small numbers or big numbers, to see that your key works all right and that the items themselves work well.